We all had a good Veterans Day, honoring our veterans. Today, as I said, we're going to be talking about McAlpin. This may not be as long as some of the other presentations, nor next month's when we talk about O'Brien, because basically I've just got less information than I do about Dowling Park, Branford, Live Oak. Some of this stuff we've rehashed several times already, so I'm just going to go through it very quickly because it talks about the entire region of Suwannee County. Things like Native American, first settlers being the Weedon Island culture, things like that. Suwannee Valley culture of Native Americans that thrived after 750. And then by the time the Europeans arrived, the Timucua were the ones that lived here. So we know a lot more about them than the other tribes or the other indigenous peoples that were here before that. And that is pretty much a map showing the territory of the Timucua, going down past Ocala almost to Orlando, and then going up and basically through all of Georgia, over to Moultrie and Tipton and such. So, some pictures I've shown y'all several times before. This is probably the 5th or 6th time y'all seen these, to be honest. Just showing a drawing of the Timucua and also kind of how some of their villages were. And we've also talked about the fact that they are extinct basically as a tribe. The last known Timucuan died in 1767 in Cuba, where he had fled after the end of the French and Indian War that ended in 1763. Because he was native or loyal to the Spanish. So when the Spanish left, because Florida became British territory, he and the few survivors left and went to Cuba. So this group of Native Americans is extinct. And so pretty much our area was depopulated at this point until several decades later. We've got runaway slaves coming from the Carolinas, from Georgia, from Alabama, even Tennessee and such, are coming down as they were being pushed out by the Americans. And they come to be called Cimarron, which is Spanish for runaway, and anglicized to Seminole. So those are the ones that showed up in Suwannee County in the 1700s and in the early 1800s. Some of the groups were the Yamasee, the Upper Lower Creek, things like that, plus runaway slaves. And so these are the Seminoles that we know of a lot more about today. This is Osceola. And I've said many times he was not a chief. A lot of people call him Chief Osceola. He was not actually a chief, but a war leader, a little bit different. So, moving into the Second Seminole War, which was fought after the First Seminole War and before the Third Seminole War. First Seminole War was 1817, 1818, 1819, that era with Andrew Jackson. The Second Seminole War started in 1835 at the very end of it, and lasted until 1842. It was our longest war until Vietnam, or conflict until Vietnam. So, as part of that war, the United States military established several forts. Basically, every so many section and townships, they would establish a fort. So they had a system of forts all throughout, especially North Florida, going down into Central Florida. And they basically were locations not only for soldiers, but also for the scattered citizens that lived in this area to be able to flee to in times of trouble, since the Seminole were attacking their homes, destroying their crops, killing their people. And so several forts were established in what's now Suwannee County, and I've got that map circled. Inside that map there's a fort that was established very close to present-day McAlpin. So that's why I show it. I don't even remember the name of it, if it was even in the records. Sometimes it was basically just listed as where it was, like 16 East Florida, or 3 West Florida, depending on where it was. Others had an alternative name like Fort Jelks or Fort James or Fort Pierce and things like that. Sometimes they were more better known by those other names. But this was the one around McAlpin that was established. And after the war ended in 1842, like a lot of these forts, there probably wasn't even much to it. But after the war ended, they pretty much just scavenged the materials, repurposed it for other uses. So there's really nothing that remains in Suwannee County that we know of these forts. There are a few other spots outside of Suwannee County where they've got a little bit more left. I think there's a reproduction down in Central Florida of one of the forts based upon, it's in the original location based upon the archaeological evidence found. But it's a little bit more substantial than Suwannee County has. But that was the Second Seminole War, and the Seminoles pretty much that lived here were finally pushed out at the end of that war. They either went over to Oklahoma, at the time it was Indian Territory, or they went down to South Florida where nobody, no American would ever want to live, at the time anyway. So not much happens in the McAlpin area from that point on through the Civil War. I mean, there's scattered folks that live, but there's no real community in the area around McAlpin until we get into the post-Civil War era. So we skip ahead basically 50, 40 years, and we get to 1880. And that's when the Live Oak and Rollins Bluff Railroad is authorized by the Florida legislature. It's supposed to go from Live Oak down through Rollins Bluff, which is modern day Branford, and then carry on, hopefully, eventually to Tampa, which is where it went in the next decade or two. So the stockholders, people like John F. White, Charles K. or C.K. Dutton, Henry M. Wood, H.S. Haynes, Henry Wise, Robert Ivy, Joseph Ruff, William Bryson Jr., Washington L. Irvin, Daniel M. McAlpin, C.R. King, and William B. Taylor. Pretty much every one of these guys I've talked about in my presentation at some point. One or two of them, maybe not. But these guys were very influential. They were politicians, they were businessmen, they were government officials, all kinds of different things they did. But they were big into this railroad and pushing one of several railroads that would come into Suwannee County in the late 1800s. So this Live Oak and Rollins Bluff Railroad is eventually established. It's completed in 1882, and then years later it goes down to Tampa, and it becomes part of the Savannah, Florida and Western, SF&W Railroad, that is eventually owned by Henry Plant, one of those two Henrys in Florida's railroad history that we've talked about in times past. But this kind of helps to grow the south part of Suwannee County, below Live Oak, a lot more than it had been. So shortly after, about the time that railroad was completed, you will see communities popping up. Some of those we've talked about no longer exist, but you find out about the community of Pine Mount. And sometimes it's listed as one word, Pine Mount, sometimes it's two words, as Pine and Mount. But that community exists in 1883 is when it's established, and it's established on the SF&W Railroad, or the railway. By 1886 and 1887, there are notes in various publications and such that describe it having a population of 200 people. So within 3 or 4 years, it's basically gone from nothing to 200 people. And it had lumber, cotton, and vegetables as the main products. And at the time, it was larger than McAlpin, which was established at about the same time as Pine Mount. 1886, 1887, that era, it had 3 general stores, a steam-operated sawmill, a public school, and a Baptist church. So that's Pine Mountain. You can see here on that map, just below the 2 ends in Suwannee. And that was just north of McAlpin, but it's in the same area, so I wanted to talk about it also. Pine Mountain, I mean, we've had lots of communities over the years, 100 plus communities in Suwannee County, most of which we don't know much about other than they're a dot on a map or just a name mentioned in a record. Pine Mountain, we've got a little bit more information because it was platted, and we have the actual plat there at the clerk's office where I work. And this was it as platted in 1893. So basically 10 years after it was established, they decided it's got enough people and enough things that we want to plat it out and record it in the official records. So you can see all these lots that have been established. You can see some acreage there to the top right, and down on the east side of the properties, or on the right side, I should say. The depot is up there at the top of that map.
So the small lots, how big would they be?
You know, like 60 by 100-ish type things. Enough to put a house and a couple of chickens on. The Methodist church you can see there on the bottom left. The mill property owned by Mr. Peacock there towards the center bottom. You've got several Peacocks that own property there that are listed. The Reeds, I have to do some research. I don't know if that might be Robert Reed, who was clerk of court about this time, or if it's a different Reed. But Mr. Reed's got several properties in the center. Peacocks have a lot of them. You can see there, so lots of different names. And those were already purchased by the point this time was platted. But you can see the railroad, the SF&W Railroad, there at the top. So this map is actually turned 90 degrees because the railroad would have been north and South Running. So everything's cockeyed, just because that's how it was platted. So, but that is Pine Mount. But like a lot of other communities that we've talked about and we will continue to talk about, early 1900s, you've got better roads, you've got better automobiles, or you've got automobiles and then they get better. These little communities are no longer needed. You can drive into Live Oak or Branford or Dowling Park or McAlpin, and so not much remains of them today. Pine Mount basically has a Baptist church name that still exists in the McAlpin area.
Were there houses? Did people build houses on those lots?
Yes, yeah, maybe not every lot, but several of those lots.
There's nothing there now, though, is there?
Not really, no.
Is that railroad bed on the opposite side of 129?
Yeah, the rails and trails, that was the old SF and Dutton, which was Live Oak and Rollins Bluff originally, yeah. We went to the railroad names, how they changed names over the years, same railroad, different names. So
My
that one
great
is that.
grandparents were in McAlpin. Gray was the last name. And they actually had a house on the little dirt road very close to the old railroad bed.
Yeah.
It's still standing, but
Oh, it is?
in the
That's a good
summer you
shape.
can't see it from all
Yeah,
the
yeah.
vines and whatnot.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I've never seen any
Mhm.
houses along there at all.
Yeah.
No, I mean, again, this was 130 years ago
Yeah.
when this was drawn. And Mr. Reed, that owns all those there, I mean, he's got 6 lots just right there. That wasn't a house in every lot, it was just, he owned the property, maybe he was gonna sell it or he rented. Same thing with these, with the peacocks and stuff. That might have been one house on this whole, not lot, but that series of lots. Block, whole block, depending on the word. But you can see some of the names. You've got Peacock Street, High Street, Reed Street, and I can't even read the top one up there. But that tells you some of the folks that were there. Brooke on the, and McGuff. So that tells you some of the folks that were involved with it, and some of the folks that own the property in or around it. But I mean, again, most of these probably never even had houses. Probably didn't even have the roads, other than a little bit of a dirt road. Kind of like when we talked about Houston in the past. Houston had all these lots that were sold. But, I mean, it even had all these different road names, but it really was in map only. They didn't actually lay out all these roads and stuff. Today, they would have had to pretty much lay them out to have subdivided. It's county regulations now. If you subdivide property and create a subdivision, you basically have to create the roads inside. But back then, let's just draw on a map, grandiose plans, and then follows through. So that's Pine Mount, however you want to spell it. There's 2 different ways that you see it. So about basically the same time Pine Mount was being established on the railroad, just south of it, within a mile or 2, you've got another community being established named McAlpin. Daniel M. McAlpin, or Daniel Munn McAlpin, was born on December 22nd, 1844. He was looks like the oldest of at least 7 children that I've been able to find anyway. He lived in Lafayette County at least part of his youth. I don't know if he was born there or not, I haven't been able to find that yet. But I do know that in 1870, he was the county superintendent of schools down in Lafayette County, because I've got a copy of a letter somebody sent me where it was written to him, where he was in New Troy, which was the capital, the county seat of Lafayette County. So he lived there at least part of his youth, if not all of his youth. By the time he got older, after 1870, the mid-1870s, he moved to Suwannee County. And lots of different things. Let's see. With his parents are buried in Lafayette County. A lot of his siblings, the records are that they were born there or they are buried there. So lots of ties to Lafayette County. But he moved to Suwannee County in the 1870s. He became known as a fiery champion of the Democratic Party in that era. Let's see. He became a state representative in 1875. In 1877, he was postmaster of Live Oak, so obviously he was no longer in Lafayette County at that point. He was also a member of the Masonic Lodge, and he was the leader of the Rousseau Lodge, which was number 39. And that was basically Suwannee County's one of the first lodges, if not the first, but in the Live Oak area. And he was the leader in 1876 and 1877. And he petitioned for a new charter for the group in 1883. And I believe it's the current, is it Barrett Lodge, I believe? that became the successor to that one. He also was a county commissioner for Suwannee County from 1877 to 1880. In 1875, he had bought out the old Live Oak Advertiser newspaper. He bought it out in 1875, and then by 1879, he renamed it to the Florida Bulletin. That one was a predecessor of what was the Suwannee Democrat, which was running for 120, 130 years before it closed up during COVID. But he was an owner of it at that point. I've actually got some newspapers at the office that showed him as the editor, so that's pretty cool, even when it's the Florida Bulletin. So he did that. Let's see what else. The Constitutional Convention of 1885 for Florida. They were going to revise the post-Civil War Constitution to make a new one. And that one went into effect from 1885 until the 1960s. Long-running Constitution that we had. But he was the first assistant secretary. So he was there, he was involved in writing stuff down and involved with that. 1887, he was a Suwannee County tax assessor. So what we call property appraisers today. His wife was Mary Wood, and she was the sister of Henry Wood. Henry Wood was also one of those that I mentioned a minute ago who helped establish that railroad. And Henry Wood helped establish the first bank here in Live Oak. So he was a big wig here in the area.
So did he marry when he came to Suwannee County?
I can't tell. I don't know. That's some of those records I don't know for sure. I guess I could look at our marriage licenses. I didn't do that. So that I might be able to find out if it was Suwannee County. But it was 1875 that he married her. They had at least 6 kids. And let's see. Yeah, that's the best picture close up I have of him. Not very good. It's like a copy of a copy of a copy. One of the other things Daniel McAlpin did was he was a veteran of the Civil War, the War of Northern Aggression, whatever you want to call it. But the Civil War, he served in the first off, he served in the 2nd Regiment of Infantry in Florida in 1861. Then he re-enlisted in the 1st Florida Regiment in 1864. And that's according to his wife's pension records that you can find online. I looked at it this morning, actually. But she filed in 1903 and again in 1909. He also, as you can see in this, was one of the founders of what was called the Suwannee Real Estate Agency in 1883. He, along with William Flake and Joseph H. Ruff, which Ruff was one of those listed on the railroad also. So they established this real estate entity. Let's see. So Daniel M. or D.M. McAlpin, as he was usually known in our records, he died in 1893, either March 31st or April 1st. In those pension files for the wife, on one page she puts April 1st, the other page she puts March 31st. So my guess is, and this is an assumption according to Eric, that he died like overnight, and she wasn't sure what hour, so she put both just to make sure. But I don't know. Maybe she just was forgetting 10 years later what it was. But anyway, he died. He's buried in the Live Oak Cemetery today. His wife survived another 40 years plus, and then she was buried beside him. A lot of their kids also were buried there at the Live Oak Cemetery.
So how old was he?
He was only 48 when he died. He wasn't that old. I mean, he was only a year or two older than me. But he'd done a lot. I mean, starting in his early 20s, he was elected office. So he did a bunch in 28 years of adulthood, pretty much. Lots of different things.
Are there any McAlpin family members still in Suwannee County?
Not that I can think of, unless they were named not McAlpin anymore,
Right.
which is possible. I know some of the kids moved off, the
Yeah.
daughters married moved off, but I can't think of any offhand, any McAlpins in the area, but I could be wrong on that. But that is the 1875 Florida legislative picture, and that's him circled according to the description of one of the descendants. So that was him in 1875. So he's doing all kinds of stuff in Suwannee County in the 1870s and 1880s, buying the newspaper, running for office and being elected to different offices, helping establish this railroad. And so in 1882, 1883, as that railroad is being established, that is allowing more of that virgin timber to be cut. and accessible, and that makes the cleared properties available for selling to people to build houses on. And so that's what happened as it started to move down further south in Suwannee County. So as a result, McAlpin is established in or around 1882. It makes sense that it's named after him because number one, he helped establish that railroad. Number two, he was a very influential Suwannee Countyan at that time with the elected offices and stuff that he was involved in. Let's see. McAlpin at that point still was mainly covered in pines. It was not cleared out yet. So kind of like the Pine Mount, some of the surveys were just kind of a name only to begin with. But let's see. Very quickly though, after the community was established and named and a railroad depot built there, people started cutting the timber. They established sawmills, turpentine stills, those kinds of things. Land was selling for $2.50 to $10 per acre at the time.
So would that pine have been native pine or planted pine?
It would have should have been the virgin, the original, been here forever pine. And then it was cut, and then it was replanted. So I didn't put any pictures in here. I should have done that, but I've shown them in some of the past presentations. They're huge. Some of the virgin timber that was here.
Would they have been longleaf?
Yes. As far as I know, anyway. The ones I've seen and heard about are the longleaf pine. Let's see. Yeah, so within a couple of years of being established, McAlpin had 2 stores and a public school. In 1886, I found a description of the area, and it talks about some of the folks that lived there. So you've got Miss Mary Bailey was the teacher at the school. A.J. Brinson was the gristmill and cotton gin operator. W.H. Brown and Son were general merchandise, and also the postmaster and the station agent. And the population was all of 30 people. So like I said, at this point, Pine Mountain was bigger than McAlpin by 7 to 1 pretty much. And this map is from 1888. One of the first I've got that shows McAlpin there. Just below Pine Mountain. This is one of the stores circa 1900, and that was the Lewis Leggett meat store. And that big thing in the background is actually the meat cooler. That was one of the several stores that popped up over the years. Then I've got several school pictures coming up, various photos I've found either in the old Echoes of the Past book that came out in 2000, or some family has given me, family that lived there have given me pictures. So you've got this photo. This was the Laughing House family, circa 1900, and they were one of the families that lived in the McAlpin area. And goes back 3 generations right there in that picture. Up until 1920, there were 3 doctors in the McAlpin area, in or just around McAlpin. Dr. McLaren, Dr. Blanton, and Dr. Harrell. There was also Bullard's Drug Store, so they had enough folks to be able to provide for the growing community that was larger than 30 people at that point. By that point, the community was centered around several general merchandise stores. There was a drug store, a gristmill, a garage, a post office, a school, and the train depot was very busy. There were still not a lot of cars in McAlpin, more so in Live Oak because the roads were better up here. But most people still use horse and buggy. It was cheaper. It's what they've been doing all their lives. And so you see a lot of that stuff going on. Those garages kind of were used originally as shoeing and blacksmith shops. Then they would shift to garages as more cars came in. The train was kind of the main means of transportation somewhere else. You would take the train to go to Live Oak or Branford or somewhere further outside of the county. That train would run twice a day. It'd go all the way from South Georgia down to Lakeland and come through here. So lots of availability to be able to hop on it and go. There was also a 1-coach passenger train that ran between High Springs and Jasper and other areas so people could go to Live Oak shop for the day. So there were lots of ways for the folks in McAlpin to travel outside of horse and buggy. More Laughing House family members there. From the Echoes of the Past history book that came out. The train depot, this is not that train depot. This is actually the one in Lurville, but the one in McAlpin would have been very similar. But there was a telegraph operator who would send messages to the community before they had the phone service, telephone service. And there was a story that I found that basically one night it was a bad thunderstorm going on, and he was tapping out a message. And then all of a sudden, people across the street, in the stores across the street, hear him yelling, crying and yelling and asking for help. Basically what had happened was while he was typing out, tapping out with Morse code, lightning hit the system and went through the Morse code and kicked him across the room. He was scared, but he was actually not hurt, so he was lucky. Tapping out all those dots and dashes and then smacked by a lightning bolt. So he was lucky. But that train depot, again, where the telegraph operator was, but the train also had a very important function for the community. And that's because there was one that came through at noon, and so the engineer would toot the whistle, and that would tell the farmers, hey, it's lunchtime, time to go in and have some lunch. So that was kind of their timekeeper of sorts in McAlpin. The trains would also stop at McAlpin for water, refills, that kind of stuff. And this is the 100,000-gallon wooden holding tank, according to the records anyway. It's not that big, but there was one there anyway, 100,000 gallons, so they say. And it burned in 1927, never to be replaced. Pretty much what happened was, and I'll just have to read this description because I don't quite get it, but maybe some of y'all engineering folks will. Basically what happens is water was pumped into one wooden tank from a nearby well. They had an engine. And then an engine originally used wood, then they started using coal, then they went to crude oil, and then finally to gasoline. And they had two large flywheels on the engine, but there was some type of round iron ball and a blowtorch at the top. So to start the engine, someone would climb on top of one of the flywheels and turn the torch on, which would heat up the iron ball, which would somehow make it go. I'm not an engineer. I'm sure some folks that are familiar with this era of railroads probably know what I'm talking about. But basically it would create a backfire that would somehow be used by the person standing at the flywheel to put it in motion. Kick-started, so to speak, I guess somehow. I don't know. I'm just reading the description that was given to me because I don't understand. So that's what would happen. Basically, that heating of the iron ball would cause it to backfire and start everything up with some human help. And then the engine would run off carburetor and such. But apparently sometimes that iron ball would explode. It'd get too hot or too brittle, and it would explode from time to time and had to be replaced. In 1927, that's what happened. It exploded, but because of all the crude oil and gas and stuff that had spread underneath it, the whole thing caught fire and burned down. And by that point, trains weren't running as regularly, and they just decided they didn't need it anymore. So I don't know if that description helped you or not. I can't picture it, but there was a well to the tank, an engine, and stuff in between. That's what I got out of it. So, other pictures, McAlpin, 1930s. This is John Henry Goff's first home and one of the family mules. And that is a picture also from Echoes of the Past. Not much of a house. I mean, you just built what you had. This is a 1930 picture of the McAlpin School, the 8th grade graduating class. Some of the families that are shown in there are Jones, Greens, Burnett's, Parkers, Goffs, Crofts, Meeks. And it said a Garnto. I'm not sure if it's a Garnto or a Gornto. I know the Gornto family was in this area, so it could just be a spelling error. But people like the Goffs, the Crofts, I mean, they're still around today in that area.
What year is this?
1930.
Their dresses are pretty short.
Yes, but 1930, I guess when they stood up, it was a little less short. But that's what it was. 1931 picture of the 8th grade class, showing more of what they usually wore. I mean, you go from dress nicely to, there we go, we got girls with coveralls on, overalls going on. That Annie, actually, the Annie is one of the overalls on the right, next to last. Annie Green, which is one of the Greens, that lived in the area also. But that is in front of the old McAlpin School, which was used by for many decades.
And do we know where that is?
I'd have to look, to be honest. I'd have to research it. I'm not sure if it's the same spot I'm about to talk about or not. It's probably closer to 129, I would think, than the one we've already briefly discussed before the presentation. But I can do some digging if need be. In 1936, we've got Franklin Roosevelt as president. We've got the New Deal. We've got all these federal works programs to put people back to work after the Great Depression. And so one of the many projects in Suwannee County is the building of a new school. It's what we call the originally Pine Mountain McAlpin School, but usually it's just called the McAlpin School. But officially it was started out as Pine Mountain and McAlpin School. So it was established, or it was authorized in 1936. The federal WPA was going to build it. It had 6 classrooms, a library, and an auditorium that can seat 400. So pretty good sized school for the area. It's T-shaped, kind of like a cross in a way. The classroom section was the upper right of the letter, the auditorium was the left, and the library and principal's office would be to the right of that. So that's pictures from the Suwannee Democrat showing it when it was dedicated in October of 1938. One of the folks there, and standing on the top left is him, is Sid Heinley. He was our state senator and native to Suwannee County. And he was the one that helped with the dedication ceremony. So today, that school is owned basically as a home and a church, monastery, if you will. And that's the best picture I can get of it from Google Earth. All the windows you can see, a lot of them are still there. So the building's now, what, 80, 90 years old almost.
Could you go back one more time? So would those have been the same windows, or did they replace them?
I'm sure they probably replaced them since then, but it's the same location basically. But yeah, they're off McAlpin Road. By the mid-20th century, McAlpin was becoming a lot more rural as there were a lot more cars and a lot better roads. Again, you could drive to Live Oak in a few minutes rather than a few hours, or Branford. So McAlpin started to die as people died, as people left, as those businesses especially started moving to where there was more access to a lot more people. Lots of consolidation in the schools that had begun in the 1920s kept hitting the McAlpin area also. By 1951, December, there is a fire in downtown, if you will, downtown McAlpin, that burns the post office and Fletcher's store, which was a general store operated by Rudolph Fletcher. So that burns in December of 1951. They determined it was a leaking heater that had spread oil and caused the fire. So it was December, it was cold, running the heater. In 1963, that McAlpin school is reorganized. The 7th and 8th grades started going to Branford, and 1 through 6 stayed there in McAlpin. But then 2 years later, they consolidated with Live Oak and Branford, basically closed that school to the kids. This is the 1950 graduating class of McAlpin. There are, let's see, some Parkers, Lees, Murphys, Skinners, Crofts, Fennels, Finks, O'Haras, and Sumners in that. But that was the graduating class, all of, what is that? 11? 13 kids. That was a graduating class in 1950. So McAlpin, next couple pages are a lot of names, and these basically were postmasters of the McAlpin post office. So started out, the first one I could find was March of 1883, which corresponds to when about the time McAlpin was established. So Francis Knight was it, then John Altman, James Roberts, John Altman again, Charles Brown, who also ran some other stuff, Early Gardner, William Starling, Raymond Starling, then you've got a woman there, Sally Starling Sessions, Jacob Brock, William Goff. I've got this list partly because of this one, Eula Fletcher. She was postmaster of McAlpin from 1918 to 1961. So long running. I mean, she was a mainstay of McAlpin. And then you got a few others after that: Alita Avery, Geraldine Van, Linda Webb. Now, when Linda Webb, at the end of her time, basically McAlpin, technically, I've got a little asterisk there to remind me. Basically, at that point, there was discussion of shutting McAlpin's post office down. People didn't like it, and so it remained open, and it still is open today. You see Art Ransom, Susan Jones, and Pam Pettyjohn current as postmaster, but technically, they're not the postmaster of McAlpin, they're the postmaster of O'Brien. And McAlpin is like a subsidiary of the O'Brien post office. So that threw me off because I know some folks that work there or that have worked there over the years. And when I Googled trying to find the list of postmasters, it ended on Linda Webb, and it's like, that can't be. There's been people there, but then I realized, okay, O'Brien took over. I talked to one of those whose husband worked there. It's like, okay, that makes sense. It's listed under the O'Brien postmaster now, not McAlpin. So Art Ransom, Susan Jones, and now Pam Pettyjohn since 2019. Lots of churches have been and are still in McAlpin and the surrounding area. And I wanted to point this one out. This one's kind of has an interesting history. It's kind of funny. Pine Mount Baptist Church. You see it spaced, Pine Space Mount Baptist Church. It was established in 1928 or shortly there before. And so the church members could not build a building on their own. They didn't have enough funds. And so what they did, which is what happened in several other locations in Suwannee County, is they pooled their resources. Oftentimes it would be with schools or with the Masonic lodges. And they would pool their resources to build one building that would satisfy for both. So what Pine Mount did was they built a white two-story rectangular structure there in the Pine Mount area. And it was the church, it was the Masonic lodge in that area, and then oddly, funnily enough, it was the Ku Klux Klan was the third group. Pooled their resources together to build that church and the building. So they built that, and W.A. Wood was the first located preacher to do what?
All one the same, huh?
Sometimes, it just depends. Yep. Could be. Could be. So in 1957, they relocated to McAlpin, which is where that building is today, basically in downtown McAlpin, but it's still called Pine Mount to honor their legacy. But it was just, that's one of those that's kind of funny. The KKK helped establish or build the first church building there. Lots of other churches in that area. I've got a list 2 or 3 pages long. Let's see, the Advent Christian Church in McAlpin was established in 1905, and it survived until sometime after 1939. And as I go through these, you'll hear me say a lot after 1939. And I'm saying that because a lot of these descriptions comes from another one of the federal government's works in the 1930s, where they would go and catalog all the churches. And so some of them, they would basically interview the preachers or people that were members there, and it might have been one that had recently shut down, so they still had information on them. Others, it was, I know it's not there anymore, but I don't know when it shut down, but it was still going in 1939 when the federal government interviewed the folks. So you'll hear me say after 1939 several times. But let's see, Advent Christian Church was located on the McAlpin and Lake City Highway, 1¼ miles east of McAlpin. Its first preacher was G.W. Green, which a lot of the Greens lived in that area. Another one was Bethlehem Methodist Church, which was established in 1867, so one of the older ones in the area. And it survived until sometime after 1939. It was an African American church. And it was located 1 mile north of Pine Mount on the Atlantic coastline, which was a later name for the Savannah, Florida Western, which was a later name for the Live Oak and Rollins Bluff Railroad. So that north-south running railroad later became the ACL. Its first known preacher was a guy by the name of Weatherspoon. You've got the Crawford Lake Primitive Baptist Church, which was established in 1893. As far as I know, it's still going. The Evergreen Church of Christ, which later was renamed the Central Church of Christ, was established in the 1890s, and it shut down about 20 years ago. It was a ½ mile south of McAlpin on the Welbert Highway. Kind of one of the descriptions says 4 miles southeast of McAlpin also. The first preacher was a guy by the name of Judd Cumby. And the Ida Grove Methodist Church which was established in 1903, shut down in 1927. It was on the McAlpin and Hughes highways, 2.5 miles southwest of McAlpin. Its first preacher was Asa Thompson. Last preacher was Willie Crew. You've got the Little River Methodist Church, 1880 to 1915, and it was in the area. Let's see. First preacher was Elias Knight. Last preacher Bill Tyson. Located 1/2 mile west of the Chutney Highway, 3 miles east of Pine Mountain. So in the area, within a few miles. McAlpin Church of God was only around for 16 years, from 1920 to 1936. It was a 1/4 mile west of the ACL, the Atlantic Coastline Depot in McAlpin. So pretty much due west of McAlpin today. First preacher was Mrs. John Daniel. Last was Sam Duckworth. Mount Pisgah Baptist Church, established in 1878, still going as far as I know in that area. Mount Sinai Baptist Church, 1875. Some sources say 1863. African American, so I'm assuming probably 1875 is probably more accurate, because 1863 was still a Civil War. They would not be establishing other churches. 2.5 miles north of Pine Mountain. Then you have the New Bethel Primitive Baptist Church, established around 1898 and existed until after 1939. It was an African American one. 7 miles west of Pine Mountain, and it was on the turpentine farm of Captain W.J. Hillman, who we've talked about before. He owned thousands of acres in Suwannee County. He was our first millionaire. So lots of property. And the first preacher there was a guy by the name of Charles Honeycutt. There was a New Bethel Baptist Church, which was established in 1939 and shut down sometime after that, African American. And its description was located in Block W of the Atlantic Coastline Railroad Pine Mountain. So back in one of those, so wherever, way on back. So Block W, which is probably not even listed on here as such, but somewhere in Pine Mountain. Way forward. Okay. First preacher was W.K. Collins of the New Bethel Baptist Church. There was the old Maple Grove Methodist Church, which was around from 1910 to 1925. It fronted the McAlpin and Welborn Highway, 5 miles east of McAlpin. And his first preacher was Jack Futch. The last preacher was somebody by the last name of Sparkman. Pine Mountain Methodist Church, 1890 to 1915. It was west of the railroad in Pine Mountain. First preacher J.S. Collins. Last one was A.C. McCall. And then finally the Pleasant Hill Baptist Church, 1882 to present, as far as I know. So that was a list of several churches that were within about 3 or 5 miles of McAlpin and Pine Mountain. So a lot of various churches. Now a lot of them shut down in the early 1900s or by the mid 1900s because people again were moving, they were consolidating, and so you see that happen. This map is a map by Susan Fennell, who lived in that area, grew up in that area, still lives here. She actually was my museum curator for several years. But she basically drew this out based on deed books and such that she had found, various records, family records. But it shows what she calls the McAlpin Business District, and I call downtown McAlpin. And it shows various businesses from 1882 to today. And she drew this in 2017 and talks about some of the schools that were in the area in the top left, some of the buildings, some of the stores, the fires that were burnt out. But you can see where the post office is today at the top center, the grist mill, the Asher Fletcher stores. Most of these are gone. You've got the Pine Mountain Church, which is there today, and you see the little fire symbols. That shows how many places burned down that she's been able to find a record of. You can see in the bottom right, McAlpin Community Center, which is there today and very active. So that's one of the buildings that's still there. You can see where the old train depot was located. And north is to the left. So that gives you a good idea of downtown McAlpin during its heyday. See the Bullard Drug Store I mentioned earlier, the Starlings. There's the blacksmith, Will Jenkins shop, the grist mill, the cotton gin, the Asher Fletcher store at the top I talked about burning down. So lots of different stuff. So that was basically downtown McAlpin over the years. And you can see where the railroad used to be. which is now part of the Rails and Trails, the Greenway Trail. So downtown McAlpin today, most of the old stores are gone, mostly burned down, never replaced. The depot was no longer necessary, they didn't stop there anymore, and so that was torn down and gotten rid of. And McAlpin has nearly dried up, not quite, but it's definitely not like what it used to be. The consolidation of schools didn't help. Again, better access to roads, better access to other places. Almost ended the place, but it's still here. It's very quiet, it's residential. That's a picture off Google Earth I downloaded last week. I'm not sure what the date that it was, picture was made, but that shows, if you will, downtown McAlpin today, which is on the opposite side of where downtown McAlpin used to be, because that's 129 looking north to the left. So over here to the east, McAlpin, historically speaking, was over here on the west side. So just it's grown up that way. The Pine Mountain Baptist Church is on the west side. So I got done early. That's the history of McAlpin. Now, if you want to know even more details about the history and the families and stuff, I suggest you talk to Susan Fennell. She's got a lot of information on that. A lot of her family, I think she was a Goff family was one of hers, but she's done a whole lot of research beyond what I've done. But she's got a lot of good information. So I want to thank her for some of this information, and then all those over the years that have helped me get through some of this stuff and find it, lots all over the place. Any thoughts, comments, questions? 10 minutes early, how about that? Thank y'all.